Welcome to the debate. If you've ever walked out onto a completely frozen lake,
Oh, yeah.
like a really crystal clear one, in the dead of winter, you might have experienced this kind of terrifying optical illusion.
Right.
You look straight down, and the bottom of the lake looks like it's, I don't know, maybe 3 feet below your boots.
Yeah, it's completely disorienting.
Exactly. But if you were to actually drop a line down through a hole in the ice, you'd find the bottom is actually 30 feet deep. The physical reality of your environment is just fundamentally different from what your eyes are telling you.
The visual cues are completely distorted by the medium you're looking through.
Right.
It is incredibly unnerving, and your brain just screams that you are about to fall in, even though you might be standing on, 2 feet of solid ice.
Exactly. And when we step into the flight deck of an Airbus A320 or A330 during extreme winter operations, we face the exact same deception.
Mm-hmm.
But this time, it's our instruments lying to us.
Right.
To understand why, we have to look at the physics of how an aircraft altimeter actually works. The barometric altimeter is calibrated to what we call the International Standard Atmosphere.
Which assumes a sea level temperature of 15 degrees Celsius.
Right, 15 degrees Celsius. It essentially measures air pressure and translates that into altitude. But it assumes the atmosphere is behaving normally.
Which in extreme cold weather operations, it absolutely is not.
No.
Colder air is substantially denser than warm air. It physically packs together closer to the ground.
Yeah, it compresses.
Exactly. So the atmospheric pressure levels that the altimeter is looking for are physically compressed downward.
Precisely. So to find the specific air pressure that corresponds to, say, 2,000 feet on the dial, the aircraft actually has to descend to a physically lower altitude.
Right.
This causes our barometric altimeters to vastly overestimate our true altitude. The old training adage is, cold and low, look out below, because while your primary flight display says you're at a perfectly safe altitude, your aircraft is physically residing much closer to the terrain.
It's a terrifying scenario if you aren't prepared for it.
It really is. And today, we are analyzing the mitigation of this severe controlled flight into terrain, or CFIT threat. Specifically, we're debating the modernization of vertical approach guidance.
Okay.
I represent the perspective that our training priority must be maximizing the utilization and standardization of the automated FMS Landing System, known as FLS.
Right.
When understood and utilized correctly, it provides the most mathematically precise, standardized defense against cold weather threats.
And I represent the perspective that while the FLS architecture is mathematically impressive, relying heavily on its partial compensation logic introduces highly dangerous new cognitive traps.
Okay.
It demands an extreme level of manual monitoring vigilance over raw data and degradation sequences that frankly can easily overwhelm a crew in a high-threat winter environment.
Well, I completely understand the hesitation around new automation paradigms. Anytime we introduce a new system, there's a learning curve.
For sure.
But the shift FLS brings to non-precision approach safety is nothing short of revolutionary.
That's a strong word.
But it's true. Historically, flying a non-precision approach in the cold was a high workload, high-risk endeavor. The math was entirely on the pilots. With FUGS, which is part of the modern XGLS concept, we standardized the cockpit.
Okay, so walk us through the actual workflow then.
Yeah, so when the crew is setting up the approach, they go down to the MCDU, the main computer interface.
Right.
And on the performance approach page, they enter the surface temperature, the outside air temperature, or OAT.
Mm-hmm.
The flight management system takes that specific temperature data point and uses it to mathematically calculate a brand new, artificially steepened virtual glide slope.
Right, the FGS.
Exactly. It automatically compensates for that compressed air column to give you a true geometric 3.0-degree descent path straight to the runway.
It is a beautiful piece of avionic engineering. I'll give you that. On paper.
Well, it is a massive operational safety enhancement in practice, too. If you compare it to the legacy final app mode, the difference is night and day.
Because of the temperature compensation.
Right. Final app provides zero temperature compensation. It tracks a distorted barometric pressure gradient straight into the ground.
Right.
When temperatures drop below published charted limits, utilizing Final App is strictly prohibited.
Right, you're not allowed to use it.
Exactly. and that restriction forces crews to downgrade their automation and fly in high workload selected modes, manually adjusting their track and their flight path angle.
Yeah, TRK-FPA mode.
Right. FLS, conversely, gives the pilot double diamonds on their display that look identical to a standard instrument landing system, or ILS.
Okay.
It keeps the monitoring workload low, it keeps the sight picture standard, and it keeps the precision high.
See, I agree. The mathematical calculation happening in the background is elegant. But standardizing the sight picture with those double diamonds actually breeds a highly dangerous form of automation complacency.
How so?
Well, it does this precisely because FLS only partially compensates the profile.
I'm not sure I follow how standardizing the path creates complacency. I mean, the virtual beam the computer builds is anchored directly to the runway coordinates.
Yes, the final segment virtual beam is corrected. But that is the critical flaw of the system's design. FLS only corrects that final glide path down to the runway.
Okay.
Think of the approach in phases. You have the initial approach, the intermediate step-down fixes, and finally the decision altitude.
Right.
The automation does not correct those earlier intermediate phases. They still require intense manual calculation using the IKO cold temperature error table.
Right, the crew still has to manually input those corrected altitudes into the flight control unit and the computer.
They do, that is true. They still have to do the math for the intermediate segments.
So you have created a mixed state in the cockpit. It's exactly like having a car with highly advanced autonomous steering, but the system leaves you entirely responsible for manually operating the brakes.
That's an interesting analogy.
You might feel incredibly safe because the steering wheel is turning perfectly on its own, but you are in a highly dangerous mixed state.
Yeah.
The driver relaxes because the automation is handling one complex task, completely forgetting they are entirely responsible for preventing the crash by braking.
Okay, I see what you're saying. The pilot must manually safeguard the intermediate phases, while the automation handles the final descent. This creates a complex human factors trap that is far more insidious than simply flying a fully manual selected approach.
Because in a manual approach, they're engaged the whole time.
Exactly. They are highly engaged because they know they are responsible for every single parameter from start to finish.
I hear that concern about the mixed state, I really do. But look at the alternative. When we evaluate system fragility and workload, the operational flexibility of the FLS is just unmatched.
Okay.
Because the FMS builds that virtual beam anchored to the runway, it projects it outward for up to 100 nautical miles.
Right.
It acts just like a physical ILS radio beam. If air traffic control vectors you completely off your programmed flight plan, the FLS virtual beam remains out there, available for capture whenever you intercept it. Furthermore, the autopilot can stay coupled all the way down to a minimum use height of 200 feet above the ground.
Okay, but let's compare that to final lap.
Right. The legacy final lap mode is rigidly, uncompromisingly tied to the computer's flight plan sequencing. If you are vectored off the path, final apps simply refuses to engage until you manually update the computer sequencing.
Which takes time and heads down bandwidth.
Exactly. And it forces you to disconnect higher at 250 feet.
But let's look at the foundation of that virtual beam you are praising. You talk about its flexibility, but you are completely bypassing its extreme fragility.
Fragility?
Yes. FLS is not a physical radio beam transmitted from the ground like an ILS. It is a mathematical construct generated in the aircraft's computer, and it relies strictly on barometric input from the altimeter.
Well, yes, it uses the altimeter.
And because it is fundamentally barometric, it is incredibly sensitive to the local altimeter setting, the QNH.
Right.
If a pilot makes a tiny data entry error on that subscale, the consequences are massive. A mere 1 hectopascal error entered by the crew shifts the entire virtual vertical profile by 30 feet.
Which is precisely why Airbus has standard operating procedures for altimeter crosschecks.
SOPs are vital safety nets, yes. But human beings, under high workload, make data entry errors.
Of course.
If the local altimeter setting, the QNH, is misset by just 10 hectopascals, say the ATIS reports 1013 and they dial in 1023 because of a slip of the hand.
Okay, the pilot follows those ILS look-alike perfectly centered double diamonds to a point 300 feet lower than indicated.
Wow, yeah.
And because it looks identical to an ILS, the pilot's cognitive reflex is to trust the centered diamonds implicitly. It is an artificial beam that can lead you right into the granite if a single data entry is fat-fingered.
The sensitivity to the altimeter setting is very real, I'll grant you that. But that is exactly why Airbus imposes such strict ground altimeter cross-checks before you even begin taxiing in sub-freezing weather.
Right. You aren't just glancing at the dials. You are checking the left primary flight display against the right primary flight display.
With a maximum allowable difference of what, 20 feet?
Exactly. Just 20 feet. Then you check those primary displays against the independent standby instrument, the ISIS, and that has a maximum difference of 100 feet.
Mm-hmm.
The system isn't fragile. It simply requires the professional discipline inherent in the A320 and A330 flight deck.
But you have to admit, the physics of atmospheric compression actively work against standard pilot monitoring techniques once you are in the air.
Well, the environment is challenging, yes.
Let's look at the deception of the barometric altimeter during the descent. We teach pilots to continuously verify their descent profile using an altitude versus distance check, right?
Of course.
You look at the approach chart, you see you should be crossing exactly 2,000 feet at 6 miles from the runway, and you check your altimeter to ensure you are on profile.
Right.
But because of the severe cold, the air has physically compressed. The altimeter is confused. So even if you are on a flawless, perfectly compensated glide path, your altimeter will read substantially higher than the charted altitude at every single distance check.
Right, because of the cold air.
You check at 6 miles, the chart says 2,000, your altimeter says 2,200. Trainees constantly fall into this altitude versus distance trap.
Oh, I've seen it in the sim so many times.
They see they are indicating 200 feet high, and their brain tells them the virtual glide slope is failing, or they are ballooning above the path.
Yeah.
They instinctively try to make destabilizing manual aerodynamic corrections to get back down to the charted altitude.
Which is incredibly dangerous because they assume a system failure when they are actually observing physics in action.
Exactly, and the ultimate safety net we rely on, the Terrain Awareness and Warning System, the TAWAS or EGPWS.
Right.
It might remain completely silent as they dive toward the ground.
Wait, silent? Why wouldn't it trigger?
Because the air is compressed globally across the region, right? The entire descent path shifts downward parallel to the system's terrain clearance floor.
Oh, wow.
The aircraft's physical trajectory often remains just outside the alert envelope. You will get no too low terrain audio warning. The entire monitoring architecture we rely on is compromised by the cold.
The monitoring environment is undeniably complicated by extreme cold. I'm not arguing that. But you are using that difficulty to argue against automation.
I'm arguing for awareness.
But the reality is manual flight path workarounds are demonstrably, historically more dangerous.
Let's deep dive into the tragic Air Canada Flight 624 CFIT accident in Halifax.
Right.
That perfectly illustrates the danger of manual flight path management in cold weather. The Halifax crash is a profound lesson in aerodynamics, yes.
Let's walk step by step through the pilot's cognitive process in that scenario. The crew correctly recognizes it's cold, so they manually add altitude to ensure safe clearance over the intermediate terrain.
Okay.
Let's say they add 300 feet to the final approach fix altitude. So they arrive at that fix ready to descend, but they are physically 300 feet higher than the standard profile.
Right.
When they begin their descent to the runway, the human instinct is to manually steepen the descent angle, the flight path angle, or FPA, on the flight control unit.
To forcefully catch the runway threshold from that artificially high starting point.
Precisely. Instead of flying the charted -3.0 degrees, they dial in -3.5 degrees to aggressively intercept the visual path.
And this is where the trap snaps shut.
Yes, and this is fatal. The altimeter temperature error is not constant. It decreases linearly as you approach the ground.
Right.
The error is massive when you are at 3,000 feet, but it shrinks to absolute zero exactly at the runway surface elevation.
Because there's no longer an air column below you to compress.
Right. So if a pilot flies a steeper, constant angle from a corrected high altitude, the aircraft descends rapidly through an error scale that is constantly shrinking.
Wow.
The math collapses on itself. This causes a severe vertical undershoot. The aircraft's actual physical descent rate toward the ground is terrifyingly steep, and they crash short of the runway long before the visual segment.
Yeah, it's a terrible situation.
FLS autocompensation mathematically adjusts the beam continuously to prevent this exact pilot-induced aerodynamic error. It takes the lethal guesswork out of managing the flight path angle.
Theory and elegant math are great, but let's see what happens when your automated philosophy hits a real-world degradation.
Okay,
Picture us flying a high-workload line scenario.
let's do it. Set the scene.
We are flying a simulator event into Jackson Hole, Wyoming, an airfield completely surrounded by jagged, mountainous terrain.
Oh yeah, Jackson Hole is tough.
It's an RNAV approach utilizing global navigation satellite systems, so GPS, to LNA nav minima. The surface temperature is minus 28 degrees Celsius, well below the published cold temperature limit for the airport. High terrain, extreme cold, high threat.
Okay, standard procedure. The crew applies the all segments method for manual corrections.
Right.
They pull out the IKO tables. They manually calculate the corrections for the initial and intermediate segments. They communicate this clearly to air traffic control, saying, request 9,700 feet for cold temperature operations, ensuring vertical separation from other traffic.
Right, they have to let ATC know.
Exactly. And they correctly keep the final decision altitude correction strictly inside the cockpit, entering it on the computer's approach page. They also enter that minus 28 degrees surface temperature on the same page, which triggers the FLS to automatically steepen and compensate the final virtual beam. Everything is perfectly managed, highly standardized, and safe.
Perfectly managed right up until the system logic violently contradicts the operational reality.
Okay, what happens?
Here's the trap. You are established on the final approach segment, passing 2,500 feet above the ground.
Okay.
The instructor in the back of the simulator triggers a GPS sensor degradation. The cockpit immediately sounds a triple-click audio warning.
Right, the downgrade chime.
On the primary flight display, the flight mode annunciator, the FMA, drops its capability status from FAPP down to FAPP plus raw.
Well, the system is doing its job. It's notifying the crew that the sensor accuracy has degraded.
Yes, but look at the insidious nature of the trap. The autopilot remains fully coupled.
Right.
The aircraft is flying smoothly, and those FLS double diamonds remain perfectly, flawlessly centered.
Okay.
The aircraft appears to be happily flying the correct trajectory, but what does that raw indication in FAPP plus raw actually mandate?
Well, it means you have to monitor raw data.
It is a strict system rule that the pilot must now manually cross-check the virtual FLS path deviations against conventional, independent, ground-based radio nav aids.
Right. Standard degradation monitoring.
But you are flying an RNAV approach.
Oh.
It is entirely based on satellites and computer positioning. There are no conventional ground-based nav aids.
Wait, so the system downgrades to raw mode. That strictly mandates the pilot cross-checks their virtual path against a physical VOR or NDB ground beacon?
Exactly. But you are on an RNAV. There are no ground nav aids. They literally do not exist for that approach procedure.
That is incredibly insidious. You're staring at perfectly centered double diamonds, the autopilot is flying smoothly, and the system is implicitly demanding data you cannot provide.
It is the ultimate FLS design flaw. The system presents a perfectly serene picture, seducing the crew into continuing the descent.
Wow. But Airbus standard operating procedure dictates that flying an RNAV approach in FAP plus raw is strictly prohibited.
Right, because you can't satisfy the monitoring requirement.
Exactly. It requires immense cognitive discipline for a pilot to hear a triple click, look at perfectly centered guidance, realize the raw data paradox, manually disconnect the automation, and execute a mandatory go-around into the freezing mountains.
Yeah, that takes a lot of discipline.
In the simulator, the human instinct is to trust the centered diamonds and press on directly into the terrain.
I see the paradox you're highlighting, and I absolutely see why that causes simulator crashes, but I interpret that system behavior as a feature, not a flaw.
Wait, a feature? How can a paradox be a feature?
Because the aircraft explicitly identifies its own capability degradation. It evaluates its internal sensor limits and essentially tells the pilot, I no longer have the required navigational performance to fly this trajectory independently.
But it does it while leaving the diamonds centered.
Right, but the fact that this occurs on an RNAV approach doesn't make the logic flawed. The failure isn't the automated landing system. The failure is a crew not deeply understanding the system limitation contradiction.
That feels like blaming the crew for a bad interface.
No, it's about system knowledge. If a pilot continues an RNAV approach under an FAP plus raw status, that is a training failure, not an automation trap. It simply means they do not understand what the word raw actually dictates on their display.
But you have to admit, the human-machine interface is actively working against the pilot's psychology in that moment.
It is challenging, I agree.
We are handing them a system that, going back to our earlier point, only partially corrects the altitude profile. It requires them to make manual altitude inputs on the control panel.
Right.
Demands they coordinate with air traffic control for only some of those altitudes.
Yeah, the intermediate ones.
And then, at the most critical moment of flight, it presents them with perfectly centered, safe-looking guidance during a scenario that strictly mandates a go-around.
It's a lot to process.
That is a massive amount of operational bandwidth required just to supervise the automation's contradictions.
Which brings us to the core of our synthesis today. Despite our disagreement on the philosophy of how heavily we should lean on automation, we fundamentally agree on the non-negotiable laws of physics in cold weather operations.
Absolutely. The physics of the atmosphere do not care about our opinions on avionic architecture.
No, they do not.
The most critical takeaway is that altimeter subscales, the QNH setting, are never, ever manipulated to correct for cold temperature. You never touch the barometric setting to fix a cold weather error.
Never.
You only ever apply corrections by adding the calculated mathematical value directly to your target. Is a guaranteed path to a vertical undershoot.
A guaranteed crash.
And we also agree that while the FLS represents a mathematically elegant solution to the final segment geometry, it absolutely does not absolve the crew of applying the ICAO cold temperature error tables to the initial, intermediate, and missed approach segments.
Exactly right. Entering the surface temperature on the computer's approach page is not a magic bullet that fixes the entire flight plan. It only safeguards that final virtual beam.
Right.
Where we maintain our unresolved divergence is the baseline training priority. I maintain that the FLS standardization, giving the pilot identical ILS look-alike double diamond indications across all non-precision approaches, and the automatic final segment compensation make FLS the absolute safest baseline for winter operations. By standardizing the visual cues, it drastically reduces the cognitive load during the most critical high-stress phase of flight.
And I maintain that FLS's inherently half-automated nature, combined with its extreme mathematical sensitivity to QNH missetting, demands a training culture that cannot just passively lean on the automation.
Okay.
We must root our simulator sessions primarily in deep system skepticism, manual IQO calculations, and a rigorous raw data monitoring discipline.
Right.
If pilots don't deeply understand the underlying barometric vulnerabilities, the automation will quietly mask the threat until it is far too late to recover.
It's a fascinating tension between advanced capability and human monitoring bandwidth. As a final typewriting instructor and examiner debrief thought, I think this discussion proves there is so much more to explore and how advanced avionics intersect with human factors.
For sure.
True safety in the flight deck doesn't come from just memorizing the procedure flow. It comes from deeply understanding why the aircraft behaves the way it does under the hood.
Precisely. You have to understand the logic behind the glass. You can't just follow the magenta line.
Think back to that completely frozen lake we talked about at the beginning.
Right.
The automation might give you a crystal clear, beautifully calculated picture of what it thinks the depth is. But if you don't understand the optical illusion of the ice...
If you don't inherently respect the physical reality of atmospheric compression...
Exactly. You might step right through it. We'll leave it to our listeners to decide which philosophy should drive their next simulator session.